I am asked by students all the time, what level am I? And that's a really difficult question to answer in the world of piano because there are so many different ways to measure levels in piano based on whether you're a classical player or you're a jazz player or you like to play pop. So I've come up with a list of things that every intermediate piano player should be able to do in order to call themselves intermediate. And this list it forgets about all of the genre specific things and it just looks at those core skills. So this could work as like a really good test for you to figure out what level you're at. And if you're at that stage where you're kind of thinking maybe you've moved away from being a beginner and into an intermediate level, it would be a great checklist for you to see if you actually have. And if not, it'll give you some things that you can look at that you know that you need to work on in order to take yourself to that next level. The first thing is technique. So when I say technique, I mean scales and triads and arpeggios. And a beginner player can maybe play C major scale, hands together, up and down. Maybe they also play G and D, maybe A, and they can also play the relative minors of those scales. An intermediate player should be able to play all of the scales on white keys from A to G. So you can play A major, B major, C major, D major, E major, F major, and G major, and their relative minors at a minimum of 80 BPM considering eighth notes. So that's a fairly good pace. You should be able to do that hands together, and you should be able to do it with confidence. And it's, one thing to kind of play a scale like that, and it's another thing entirely to play along with a metronome. So that's a really important point to note, that an intermediate player can play confidently along with a metronome. An intermediate player should also be able to play hands together in versions like this, in broken and solid form in all of those keys, as well as 2-octave arpeggios in all of those keys, hands separately and hands together. An intermediate player should also know the difference between a natural minor and a harmonic minor and a melodic minor. So that's a lot of minors, but an intermediate player should know that. An intermediate player should be able to say that this is a major chord and that this is a minor chord, and be able to identify that by ear. I should also say that an intermediate player knows the difference between major and minor and dominant and diminished seventh chords. So intermediate player knows that's a major 7, that's a minor 7, that's a dominant 7, and that's a diminished 7. Now, those are really complicated to practice in inversions and up and down and with both hands. So an intermediate player doesn't need to do that, but they do need to know the difference between those chords and have at least begun on practicing them in simple keys. The next main area that an intermediate player needs to be considering is chord progressions. So technique is often focused on very heavily in traditional training methods, and learning to play chord progressions is often ignored. And I think it's incredibly important, and as a well-rounded piano player, you need to be able to know how to play a chord progression in at least a few keys. So an intermediate player understands what the 1, 5, 6, 4 progression is, and also understands what the diatonic chords of any given key would be. So think of all those scales that you should know. You should be able to identify the diatonic chords of that scale, and then be able to put together chord progressions like the 1, 5, 6, 4. Now the other thing about an intermediate player is that an intermediate player can play those chord progressions using inversions. So a beginner might go 1, 5, 6, 4. An intermediate player can use inversions. 1, 5, 6, 4. And an intermediate player is also beginning to experiment with different rhythms in those progressions, right? I can play some very simple fills, passing notes. Those are good signs that you are at an intermediate level with your chording. The The next thing is music theory. So an intermediate piano player has this basic but solid understanding of music theory. So you don't have to have read a bunch of theory books or taken any exams, but you should understand that scales are made up of whole steps and half steps, and you should understand that there's a formula for a major scale that's different than a minor scale. You should understand that the whole notes equal 4 beats, and that a dotted half note equals 3 beats. So you should understand all the note values. You should be able to see notes and clap their rhythm based on their note values. You should understand time signatures. So an intermediate piano player is playing in time signatures outside of just your standard 4/4. They can play in 3/4, 6/8. So those are things to consider as you decide, am I beginner or intermediate? Can I do those things theoretically? Now, theory also leads us into sight reading. This is kind of a gray area for me because I've never been an excellent sight reader, and I worked very hard at it my entire life. So I would not consider myself a late intermediate sight reader. I'd probably consider myself an early intermediate sight reader. Even though I know a lot, putting that into practice is really difficult. So as an intermediate player or an early intermediate player, you should be able to look at some simple notation and figure it out. You don't have to be able to sit down and just play it. I mean, that'd be fantastic. But if you can look at it and go, okay, I know that's F and I know that's G and I know they're played in this rhythm, you spend a few minutes and you can work it out, then you can consider yourself an intermediate piano player. Next up is repertoire. So an intermediate piano player has at least, I'm going to say 10 pieces that are basically performance ready, that you could go, okay, I can sit down and I can play Let It Be, or I can play this little waltz by Chopin. Maybe it's not Chopin, Chopin can be tricky. But you know what I'm saying? You've got 10 songs that you can sit down and you could play for your friends and family, and you could play them fairly confidently with few to no mistakes. And you also have a greater repertoire than those 10 songs that you've developed as you've kind of grown as a player. So you want to have 20 or 30 or even more songs that you've worked on that with a little bit of review you could bring up to a performance level. So yeah, it's great if we can play the piano, but if we don't have songs that we can actually use and perform, then we're not, what's the point? So be considering that you should build a repertoire, and a great little hint for this is to, I'm really going to date myself here, be old-fashioned and suggest a binder or a list or a notebook. But I think a great way to track your repertoire is to keep it all in one place. So you could print out those songs and put them in a binder, and you can have little sections where you've got, what I'm currently working on, what I've previously mastered, what I need to review to keep it fresh. That's a great way to keep your repertoire up to speed. And then finally, and this may be one of my most important points here, the difference between a beginner player and an intermediate player is that an intermediate player can play with dynamics and really make you feel something when they perform. So an intermediate player understands what a crescendo is. An intermediate player has the confidence and comfort at the piano to kind of sink into the keys and use their body a little bit as they play and take you on a bit of an adventure. They can build an intensity and then bring it right back down. So that takes time and practice, and it takes technical proficiency, and it takes some level of just commitment to being in the emotion of the piece that you're playing. And that's something to really keep an eye open for when you're trying to decide if you're a beginner or intermediate. Are you confident enough at this instrument that you can kind of let go a little bit of all the thinking and the notes and get into the feeling of the piece that you're playing, so that your audience can go along with you and have this amazing experience as you perform for them? So those are the things on my list for what would define a beginner from an intermediate player. So I would love to hear from you what kind of a player you think you are. Do you think you land in the beginner or intermediate? Below, you're going to see a list of all of the points that I just touched on, so you can use it as a checklist, and I would love to hear from you if you think that I missed anything. In my experience so far, piano players are very opinionated, which is wonderful, so I would love to hear your opinions, even if they are controversial. If you completely disagree with me, I want to hear about it. So happy commenting, happy practicing, and thanks for watching.